It's a big political year for Wisconsin, with recall elections coming up soon, and one of those facing a recall, Republican Governor Scott Walker. Fox 11's Robert Hornacek joins us now with Governor Walker. Morning, Robert.
Well, good morning, Rachel. Governor Walker is in our studio. He's going to be touring parts of the state today to talk about the savings realized in the state budget. Good morning, Governor Walker. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
You say there's been $1 billion in savings so far in the state budget. How did you come to that number? And is it really a savings, or is this simply a transfer of money, since so many state employees and public employees are now paying those costs?
Well, it's savings because that's building the base. It's not one-time amounts like we saw in the past with some of the federal stimulus out there. These are ongoing savings built into both state and local government budgets. In fact, later this morning I'm going to be with Bob Ziegebauer, who for many years was a Democrat in the state legislature, the Manitowoc County executive. We're going to be with him, with mayors, with school board officials from the eastern part of the state of Wisconsin. It stops there, and then later in Brown Deer, where people are going to talk about the examples in their given communities of how our reforms have helped them save money in many cases that were put back into our county, our school districts, our local governments. This is $1 billion, and people can literally go to results.wi.gov, that's results.wi.gov, and they can click on their county. So Brown County, Outagamie County, you name it, people can click on there and they can see the actual reports, be they from the media, be they from local governments' agendas, where they talked about the savings, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's contributions, whether it's other things like that. All that exceeds, very conservative estimates, exceeds $1 billion in savings for the taxpayers.
When you look back on the last year, and obviously there's been a lot of political tension, a lot of fallout from the collective bargaining changes, why was it necessary to eliminate most collective bargaining for public employees when so many said, we'll take the financial concessions?
Well, in our case, and actually it's one of those interesting things. People ask, you've asked me this before, what would you change? In my case, I probably would have spent more time trying to explain it back in January and February. I think if people had heard, if taxpayers had heard me up front say, school districts are wasting literally tens of millions of dollars because they can't bid out their health insurance, or if people had heard about the excesses in overtime, like the bus driver in Madison that got $150,000 because of overtime, I think people would have said, hey, you need to fix that. Instead, I fixed it first and explained it later. I suppose in some ways that's better than the other way around, where most politicians talk about it but never fix it. But in the future, clearly, we're going to spend more time. We've been working with Dr. Evers, Tony Evers, the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, about how to bring people together from across the state to work on education reform. We've done much of that. We're going to do more of that in the future. But in the end, we had to fix a problem out there. A few people said that they were willing to participate, but we've got more than 1,700 municipalities, 424 schools, school districts across the state, and 72 counties. Not all of them agreed. In fact, many ran out trying to get contracts in place before our reforms went into effect. That would have meant you would have had huge gaps from one part of the state to the other. We didn't want that. We wanted uniformity. We wanted every school, every local government to get those savings, and that's what we have now.
While we're on the subject of schools, I want to talk about the DPI announcement last week, some results that came out saying that school staff was down this year overall in the state, something like 2,300 positions cut. And they pointed out that that was well more than your predecessor, the most in 9 years. Your office has said that's proof that the reforms are working. Your opponents have said, look at how horrible these cuts have been.
Well, it's one of those where statistics are interesting if you don't get the full picture. In our context, if you look at layoffs, new hires versus layoffs, the reality is that there are actually more, about 1,700 more new positions in the state of Wisconsin than there were layoffs. What they account for is attrition as well as a part of that. And what they particularly overlook is that the largest single chunk of positions where there were reductions in staffing were in places like Milwaukee, Kenosha, and Janesville. The reason why our office said, well, I would say here right now, our reforms are working, is those are 3 examples of big school districts. They're only about a small percentage of all the staff in the state, yet they're about 40% of the layoffs because they didn't use our reforms. They ran out to put contracts in place. So they're operating under the way things were in the past under Jim Doyle and previous legislatures. Those districts that used our reforms did save money. They did see a change. And it's not even just in terms of saving money to keep more teachers in the classroom. It's also changes because of collective bargaining reform that allow school districts, many in this region, to say, instead of teaching 5 or 6 hours, we're going to ask our teachers to teach 6 or 7 hours throughout the school day. And that in return has put people in the classroom without having to add additional staff to make up for those retirements.
There's also been a lot of talk throughout the last year or so about trying to get the government to operate more like the private sector. And late last week, there was a lot of attention to this program to reinstate merit pay bonuses to state workers. Is there a point where the government can't operate like the private sector since it's the government and has to do certain things? And what do you say about that program? Why does it make sense to do it?
Yeah, well, long term, and in our case, most of the agencies I control through my cabinet didn't invoke that yet. It's the Department of Justice, where you've got people working hard in the crime lab to make sure that we're putting in extra time to help victims of crime, help local law enforcement. It's places like the University of Wisconsin where we can keep and enhance great education in our UW campuses across the state. Eventually, though, we'll use it in all state agencies. My hope is school districts and local governments all across the state will be able to put in place merit and performance-based incentives out there. You're right, government isn't a business, nor should anyone confuse that, but we certainly should use successful business-like techniques, and one of those is the private sector all the time pays based on performance. They say if you hit these standards, if you hit these measurements, we're going to put in place bonuses to help people out along the way. In our case, if you save taxpayers' money, you've saved now conservatively over $1 billion. You see last week that for the first time in 12 years, property taxes across the board in the state went down versus from 1998 until last year, our property taxes went up 43%. If you see real value given to the taxpayers and the hardworking taxpayers of our state, we think we should be able to reward, not just financially, but through other accolades, we should be able to reward great state and local government employees. All this that we did wasn't about punishing state or local government employees. In fact, it's the opposite. What we're trying to do is reward excellence, to hire and fire based on merit, to pay based on performance. That means in the end, in our schools, in our local governments, in our state government, we can put the best and the brightest in our classrooms and in other positions, and we can afford to keep them there.
We only have about a minute left. There's a couple quick topics I want to get to. One is jobs, which had been the centerpiece of your campaign. You had made the promise to help the private sector create 250,000 jobs over your term. Nowhere near on pace for that anymore. The state has lost jobs again last month. Where are we at that, and is that a failure of your administration to not be
not at all
where you wanted to be?
We've had, March was a challenging month, but we had the first 3 months of this year alone, just in 2012, January, February, March combined, we had more than 15,000 new jobs in the private sector. That's a 70% higher rate of job growth than they have, for example, down in Illinois. Our employment rate, 6.8%, the lowest it's been since 2008, versus places like Illinois that are 8.8%. And the real important thing to think about is we lost 150,000 jobs in the 3 years before I took office. We leveled things out. We've actually had a net gain of jobs, 15,000 plus this year alone. I think you're going to see a tremendous growth, particularly after the recall elections on June 5th. Because a lot of employers who just 2 years ago, 10% of our employers surveyed said we were heading in the right direction. This year, 94% think we're heading in the right direction. And the vast majority of those surveyed said they're going to add more jobs this year. We're heading in the right direction, but it's not going to happen all at once. Remember when Vince Lombardi took over the Green Bay Packers? The Packers were 1-10-1. The next year he didn't take them to the World Championship. He got them playing well again. And eventually, a couple years down the road, they were the world champions, one of many world championships obviously we've had in Green Bay here. The reality is we're on track because as things take off after the recall elections, you're going to see massive job growth not only this year, but in the next couple of years, and that's going to get us to that 250,000.
I actually don't remember that. I wasn't born with it. I have read about it.
I don't either. I remember learning about it. But
last question I have for you is about obviously the recall election coming up. You've got 4 Democrats who are trying to win the primary to face you. There's Kathleen Vinehout, Doug LaFollette, Kathleen Falk, and Tom Barrett. You've told me in the past that you looked forward to the recall election because you were eager to settle this and to have voters have their day. Do you still feel that way? And if you could, I know you probably won't, but if you could, tell us who you think you'll see, who you'd like to see in that general election.
Well, I think in terms of an opponent, really to me it's the out-of-state special interest money. We saw it last year. We saw it in the recalls, one of which was nearby here in Green Bay. We're seeing it now, the tens of millions of dollars from out-of-state, largely government-driven unions that are out, but other special interests. So really, that's who's my opponent is. It's not one of those names you just mentioned. Those are the people running the TAC ads. Those are the people that are trying to take this vote away from the people of the state of Wisconsin. You know, in terms of do I, for my family's sake, I don't relish recall just because of all the time it takes away and the hassle and, you know, the protest in front of my house where people were bussed in or my kids being targeted good on Facebook. I'll be glad when all that's done. But I do like the option of saying this is a clear choice. Do we want to go backwards? You know, in the past we had billion-dollar budget deficits. We had double-digit tax increases. We had record job loss I just talked about. We've gone past that. Those are things we would go back to again, whether it's Kathleen Falk, whether it's Tom Baird or any of the other candidates. They embrace exactly the same policies that Jim Doyle took us on in the past. The voters said 2 years ago they didn't want that. Instead, we want to take this positive foundation that we built together to move our state forward, to put more people to work, to make our government more responsive, particularly when it comes to education, but in healthcare. You know, we added $1 billion more to Medicaid for programs like Badger Care and Family Care out there. And we've brought improvements, more than $1 billion worth of savings for our schools and our local governments and our state government. Together, we can move the state forward, and I'd like to have the chance to do that again if people give me the honor on June 5th.
All right. Thank you very much, Governor Walker, for joining us.
Thank you.
Good day, Wisconsin. We'll be right back.